This is Suk Jong-lee, President of EAI. Let me start the second session. So I'd like to thank you, President Hanley and Victor Cha, to organize this very interesting roundtable with the EAI. I think in the morning session, we kind of discussed the regional implication and also bilateral issues. And now we are going back to the more bilateral issues. And session 2 is titled as Future Directions for U.S. ROK Nuclear Cooperation. And I'm very glad to present two excellent experts in Korea, Jeon Bong-gun, political scientist, and Dr. Im Man-sung, a professor, and he's a physical scientist. And we have equally one of the best expert in this town, Sharon Squassoni, because Victor has set the a kind of example of introducing each presenter. Let me do it in a more short way. Dr. Jeon Bong-gun, he's a professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and he had a very wider scope of experiences, and he was a political advisor to the Ministry of Unification, and also he was advisor to the president, and also he worked at the Kido New York office. So I think Dr. Jeon is one of very few political scientists in Korea who has followed this issue. And Professor Im Man-sung, the head of the Department of Nuclear and Quantum Engineering and KAIST, he has also very interesting background, and he taught at MIT and also North Carolina State University. And I think after spending years, he came back to Korea, and also he is presenting these issues very actively in the U.S. And also is advising our government. And Sharon has also very impressive background. She is a director and senior fellow at the Proliferation Prevention Program at CSIS. And before joining CSIS, Sharon worked for Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also advised Congress as the Congressional Research Service, and also she was the Director of Policy Coordination for the Non-Proliferation Bureau at the State Department. I think it's very difficult time for Koreans to stay alert because it's 3:30 a.m. in the morning, so my brain is not agile either. But let's start from Dr. Jeon's presentation. I'll give you 15 minutes maximum.
Okay, thank you. And I was somewhat glad that what I was going to present today was already, most of the key theme was spoken at the lunchtime, and especially glad to hear from American counterparts to say echoing the same kind of languages and the same goals that we try to share. Since I have only 15 minutes, despite I have prepared a little bit lengthy paper, I just get into the paper directly. First of all, I'd like to begin with what this nuclear energy means to Korea and the Koreans. It means a lot. It means a lot, and because of the following a few reasons. First, in this era of energy insecurity due to high and volatile oil prices, nuclear energy is considered one of the most reliable and semi-domestic energy source in South Korea, and that fills about 35% of its total electricity generation in Korea. South Koreans have been very sensitive to energy security since its energy self-sufficiency is about 3%, probably the lowest among the industrialized countries. And when including nuclear energy, our energy self-sufficiency jumps up to 19%. So that's why one of the reasons that nuclear energy is so important to us. And secondly, in the era of climate change, nuclear energy is the only economical and reliable low-carbon energy source in South Korea that fuels South Korea's export industry and economic growth. In Korea, the unit electricity price of nuclear power is the lowest, about 70% of coal burning and 28% of gas burning, and about 17% of oil. And the most expensive in Korea is solar, and that's about 10 times higher than this nuclear energy price. So despite Fukushima nuclear accident and a few recent safety accidents in Korea, still Koreans tend to accept nuclear power as indispensable. And thirdly, nuclear power plants become Korea's next major export item, like ships, LCD TVs, and cars and smartphones. For a country like Korea, living on export is a matter of national survival. And this one project alone, exporting to UAE, makes about $20 billion and several thousand jobs for Koreans, and expanding for 10 years. And the overall competitiveness of a Korean-made nuclear power plant is one of the very highest. And I believe it's going to be the best in the world, far ahead of the ones by Japan, Russia, and even France. And I mean the overall competitiveness of the Korean-made nuclear power plants. And finally, in order to both accelerate our green growth strategy and strengthen our energy security, Korean government is committed to invest for the future nuclear technology. Nuclear R&D plans ask for the development of a fast reactor and new pyroprocessing technology to utilize the full potential of nuclear energy and manage the spent fuel problem. Dry pyroprocessing was considered as a proliferation-resistant alternative to the existing and proliferation-prone wet reprocessing employed by most major nuclear power states. And however, despite apparent economic, industrial, and energy security benefits of a sustainable and expanded use of nuclear energy, its full implementation is some often challenges. So against this backdrop, I would like to propose that an expanded and upgraded U.S. Korea nuclear cooperation would contribute to secure and safer global nuclear governance, as well as a commercial and energy security benefits to both countries. I'd like to propose that we need a new U.S.-Korea and Korea-U.S. nuclear partnership for the 21st century. This new U.S.-Korea nuclear partnership aims to build a cooperative and mutually beneficial relationship for expanded and peaceful use and non-proliferation. The new partnership will be different from the old one, where the U.S. both sponsored and controlled Korean nuclear activities in a unilateral way under the 1974 U.S.-Korea Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. In fact, the U.S. sponsorship of the peaceful use of nuclear energy in Korea has been very successful. South Korea's first nuclear cooperation agreement with the U.S. was made in 1956, and the first research reactor, Churigan Mark II, was provided by the United States in 1962. And the first nuclear power plant were provided by Westinghouse and Goon Power in 1978. And the Korean standard nuclear power plants is based on U.S. design and U.S. origin technology. Now the new partnership asks for enhancement of peaceful use and non-proliferation bilaterally and globally. This demand was echoed at the joint vision for the alliance adopted by President Lee Myung-bak and President Barack Obama in 2009, when they said, "We aim to make a low-carbon green growth into a new engine for sustainable economic prosperity, and we'll work closely, cooperate." And also they said that we will work very closely together on clean energy research and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And when I'm suggesting that we need a nuclear partnership, in order to make a partnership, we need partners. And the U.S. has been helpful in making Korea us today. But however, we need to prove that Korea is also equally a capable partner. Otherwise, we cannot say to you that we can be a partner in this nuclear energy cooperation programs. And Korea is then we can ask why Korea and who is Korea at this time in this nuclear energy world. Korea is now one of the 4 active nuclear energy power plant supplier states, and Korea ranks the 4th in nuclear energy power generation. And also we think that if we could combine Korea's nuclear manufacturing, construction, and cooperation capability with the U.S. technology, marketing, regulation, and the certification capabilities, we could further strengthen our joint competitiveness in this global nuclear market. And otherwise, this global nuclear market could be dominated by the Russian or French, power plants, or possibly Chinese reactors in the near future. And also, as was said earlier, Korea is one of the leading champions of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security. And we can say that this year's Nuclear Security Summit, a successful event in Korea, was proving that Korea is ready to contribute for this nuclear non-proliferation security. And North Korea nuclear issue also showing that to the Koreans that non-proliferation is very important to us, and it becomes one of the important foreign policy purpose. And when I say this new U.S.-Korea nuclear partnership, I'd like to propose 4 goals to pursue together. Firstly, we can enhance common commercial interest. As Korea is committed to export more nuclear power plants to global market, Korean and American companies could team up to strengthen our joint competitiveness. Since the U.S. stopped building nuclear power plants 3 decades ago, it has lost its capability to compete alone against the French or Russian companies. Korean companies will be the best partner for the American companies since we use U.S. origin nuclear technologies and have a long and excellent history of cooperation with each other. 3 areas of cooperation for mutual benefits are noted. First, U.S. export to Korea. Secondly, U.S. export to the third world to supply Korea or U.S.-Korea joint project, as was in UAE. And third, import of Korean products to supply U.S. project, just like a Korean supply of a reactor vessel to nuclear power plants constructed in the U.S. And for example, TEPCO's project, this $20 billion project at the UAE alone, American exports exceed about $1.5 billion. And TEPCO was projecting numbers that's much higher in coming years, as Korea was committed to export more nuclear power plants. And secondly, we can utilize the sustainable nuclear energy for energy security of both countries. Then we have to solve the spent fuel problem together. Among major nuclear power producers, only 2 states United States and South Korea do not reprocess their spent fuels, thus share the serious spent fuel storage and disposal problems. And the other three top-ranked major nuclear energy producers, France, Japan, Russia, rely on reprocessing to manage their spent problems. As the global nuclear renaissance continues, more countries in other parts of the world will face the same problems. Korea's solution to the spent fuel issue was to develop an advanced spent fuel processing technology, or pyroprocessing. Korea wants to develop this pyroprocessing technology jointly with the United States for several reasons. First, once developed, this new technology could help solve spent fuel disposal problem in both countries, as pyroprocessing could drastically reduce the volume of high-level waste. Secondly, it provides proliferation-resistant spent fuel management alternative to traditional wet reprocessing. And since pyroprocessing does not separate the pure plutonium, it will have both proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear security effects. And third, both small and big nuclear power countries, nuclear power producing countries could utilize these benefits. Big nuclear energy countries could provide pyroprocessing services to smaller countries so that these smaller countries stay away from seeking their own reprocessing capability. And the pyroprocessing in Korea is also an essential part of a bigger nuclear energy research program to provide nuclear fuels for the fourth generation fast reactor system. In the U.S., skepticism on the feasibility of fast reactor is very high. But however, France, Belgium, China, Russia, India, Japan continues to develop these fast reactor programs. So Korea tried to maintain its own program. And thirdly, we need to could strengthen global nuclear non-proliferation and the safety regimes. Nuclear accidents anywhere are nuclear incidents, accidents everywhere. So are nuclear incidents. Any nuclear accident or incident would damage and disrupt our social and economic activities. As South Korea and the United States are major nuclear energy producers and global traders, both states share high stakes for the world free from nuclear accident, nuclear terrorism, and nuclear proliferation. And finally, we could present a model for the emerging and the middle nuclear power states. South Korea is one of the best performing nuclear power programs in the world. To newcomers, South Korea show how it could succeed in building and utilizing nuclear program. Here is a few of the success factors for Korean nuclear energy program. It's about Korea's close partnership with the United States, and it's a focus on peaceful use of nuclear energy only. And South Korea could show to newcomers that they do not need enrichment and reprocessing facilities for a long time until they build a massive nuclear energy program. Among the top 5 nuclear power generation states, South Korea is the only one without enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. However, instead of seeking national enrichment and reprocessing capabilities like most predecessors, South Korea seek after new technological and institutional solutions to deal with its fuel supply and the spent fuel problems, especially in cooperation with the United States and international society. multilateral approach and the pilot processing could be alternatives to both national ownership of sensitive technology and traditional reprocessing. If South Korea and the United States could work out to develop such an innovative formula, they could help dissuade other middle nuclear power states from seeking national enrichment and reprocessing programs. Here is my suggestions. In fact, in order to come up with these 4 goals, we still have a lot of obstacles and a lot of dialogues. We need dialogues to have common solutions. At the moment, we don't have a common answer to these goals and questions yet. And the Koreans and the media are watching closely Korea-U.S. nuclear cooperation negotiations and also watching how this 2009 New Alliance vision will be unfolding in the nuclear negotiations. However, there are no high-level meetings to translate this vision into actionable programs. In addition, as global nuclear renaissance continues, a strategic cooperation between the U.S. and Korea becomes urgent to enhance our both common economic and non-proliferation interests. Therefore, I'd like to propose to hold Korea-U.S. 2+2 minister-level strategic dialogues on nuclear security, nuclear energy, and non-proliferation, and to adopt a joint vision statement next year. This high-level vision statement would provide guidelines to the negotiators of both countries to this 123 agreement. And also, I believe this dialogue should be headed jointly by foreign affairs and the science, technology, and energy ministers. And we could also add heads of nuclear regulatory bodies to make it 3+3 dialogue. Here is my concluding remarks. So far, Korea's nuclear energy program was very successful. The 2 most critical success factors, these are non-technical factors, are the Korea-U.S. nuclear cooperation and Korea's decision to solely focus on civilian and peaceful ones. As I said, Americans introduced nuclear energy to Koreans in early 1950s, trained Korean nuclear engineers in the U.S., and provided technical assistance, and provided the first nuclear power plants and the prototype designs of the current Korean standard model, and finally helped us to export the nuclear power plants to UAE by having U.S.-UAE nuclear cooperation agreement. Now Korea is committed to carry our success story of peaceful use of nuclear energy and the non-proliferation to the world and to the future and into the future. The new Korea and the U.S. nuclear energy and the non-proliferation partnership will be a vehicle to enable us to fulfill this mission. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me invite Professor Im Man-sung to speak.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, everybody. This is a great privilege to speak in front of you on this important matter. The morning discussion really helped me, and also the luncheon speech was really beneficial to understand the situation in a bigger frame, and certainly I think this type of dialogue is very useful. Understanding each other is, I think, it's very important part. I think in this discussing this issue, U.S. ROK cooperation, there are really several big issues that needs to be understood. We obviously have to address the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, and we also touched upon the issue of economics, but also we need to talk about the global governance issues. And then all these things are framed in sort of a alliance between U.S. ROK relationship. So hopefully, if we can look at all those issues in a balance, maybe we can find a better answer to the question we're asking. I want to just look at the big picture in terms of what's going on today. After Fukushima accident, several things happening in the world. Some countries are shying off away from nuclear power. still at the same time there is growing demand for nuclear power in various parts of the world. It'll be difficult to extend the lifetime, but then the demand increase in the developing world and so on has to be met by somebody. The U.S. and France, two dominant players in the past, or traditionally, maybe the influence is sort of declining, especially with France, with new leadership. And then Japan's position obviously is weakening. And now Russia is increasing their, I think, capability in terms both domestic and international nuclear market. And China is likely to become also a nuclear exporter, and India maybe in the future. And then Republic of Korea as part of this nuclear market development. So let's think about the situation in South Korea first. They have a very high dependence on foreign energy import, as just mentioned. They have a very mature civilian nuclear power program, although they started as nothing, but then they have become 100% self-sufficient at this point. But this technology is based on U.S. license. That's probably a good thing for this collaboration. South Korea is basically export-driven country. Without export, they will not survive. So there is natural drive for nuclear export as well. It's only dividing country, so this issue of North Korea obviously becomes a factor, although technically it's not a factor, but I think whenever we talk about these nuclear issues, North Korea issue comes in. They have an issue with spent fuel management. They started out with maybe shaky commitment to nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation, but then since 1980 or 81, they made sort of a commitment to this peaceful development, and then thus they were able to become a model country in civilian nuclear power program. I just wanted to give you some idea about what is the role of the economics in nuclear proliferation development. There is a lot of information behind this, but then basically based on the statistical review of what happened for the last 56 years of peaceful nuclear power development, what factors might have contributed positively and negatively. If you look at this, economic openness is a very important factor. In other words, if you're not connected to the world through international trade and so on, you're not likely to be successful in civilian nuclear power development. At the same time, presence of, say, things like nuclear weapons, or pursuing nuclear weapons, is not going to be conducive to a successful nuclear power program. And South Korea at this point, with their massive investment and infrastructure development in civilian nuclear power, if South Korea ever hedges around the issue of nuclear weapon development, it'll be a disaster. And in fact, it'll be impossible for South Korea to actually, at that point, to think about nuclear weapons. So I wanted to stress the point that some people perceive this maybe discussion on South Korea's fuel cycle capability as a hedge against potential military development. Theoretically, it could be argued that way, but then in reality, it'll be really a disastrous development. I also examined the relationship between nuclear proliferation and electricity generation capability, capacity in terms of total megawatt. You may want to start out with dual purpose, exploring the possibility of developing nuclear weapons as well as commercial power capability. But that has a positive relationship potentially for the relationship. But then if you go further in pursuing nuclear weapons, or maybe even acquiring nuclear weapons, will have a negative impact on nuclear power development, peaceful nuclear power development. I think South Korea has passed that threshold at this point. If we look at the situation in the United States, obviously U.S. is the powerhouse of nuclear power technology. Among the 400-some reactors out there, about 300 reactors are U.S.-based. That's how U.S. continues to maintain its leadership, continue to maintain its global governance, safety, nuclear proliferation, and non-proliferation, and safeguarding, etc. However, nuclear power leadership in the United States is shaky at this point because of problems in the domestic arena. With continuing low-cost trend of natural gas, this country actually at this point not sure what to do with nuclear power. They were talking about nuclear renaissance, but that renaissance is not going to happen. And then at the same time, about 100 nuclear power plants are going to be decommissioned for the next couple of decades. So by the mid 2000, sometime this millennium, this country will need 100 nuclear power plant or some equivalent. Is this country capable of doing that? If not, what is going to replace that? United States has huge challenge with spent fuel management as well. Right now, Yucca Mountain, the only candidate site for high-level waste repository has been canceled, and that is going to continue with the election of President Obama. And then at the same time, the country made a commitment from 1998 will take spent fuel back, taking spent fuel basically from utilities from 1998. So far, we have paid more than $1 billion to the utilities because of the lawsuits and so on. The issue of spent fuel management is not going away. We're continuing to store it. We may not be able to find interim storage, a centralized facility. Someday, even if we store it, we'll have to find a way to finally dispose of it. The first and maybe one and only repository may not be realized. Even if it is realized, it's not enough for entire nuclear power industry. But then DOE has performed a study on advanced fuel cycle with the maybe potentially reprocessing either Purex or Urex or Pyro. We can handle the entire spent fuel inventory of the country by having one repository. So anyway, so there is a need for actually from the US side for spent fuel treatment, but that issue has been just simply put away in the back burner because it's not at this point a crisis. One other issue is US has been building just extensive capability of capacity for enrichment, as Dr. Brown has mentioned. But that was in the expectation of nuclear renaissance, globally and locally. But that's not happening. So at least not in domestic arena. So we have a couple of maybe things we can consider. Comparing the strengths of both ROK and US and the needs, respective needs of US and ROK, maybe we can find ways to collaborate intelligently. ROK's strength in nuclear power program, they have a very good safe records of operating nuclear power plants, highest capacity factors among nuclear suppliers. They are very cost effective in building nuclear power plants. Based on this report from OECD, South Korea's overnight cost is almost factor of 3 lower than the overnight cost of some of the advanced countries. They have developed this standardized nuclear reactors, and that's the model they have exported to UAE. They have a very stable supply chain. They have developed this small reactor called smart reactor Dr. Brown talked about. They've also developed this dry processing technology called DUPIC that can reprocess sort of the light water reactor fuel for CANDU reactors. And then they've been working on pyroprocessing technology at the demonstration stage. And they are perceived to be the leader by the third world countries in nuclear export. Well, US obviously has all the knowledge, know-how, experiences, and licensing, and all the actually current regime of nuclear safety, security, safeguard, and profession is basically the fabric of US effort. When I said the perceived maybe strengths of ROK's nuclear export is seen by this data gathered at Nuclear Power Asia Conference in 2012 in Malaysia. They asked this question: which country will lead the way in 2012 and beyond for nuclear power export? And the the participants said 27%, Russia 10%, France, USA 12%, Japan 5%, ROK 46%. Whether that will be realized or not, at least there is expectation out there. The chart that I have in the figure I have in the slide also is something that I have actually projected based on some mathematical modeling. So that indicates maybe strengths of maybe some of the countries in terms of nuclear export. It shows the importance of maybe the competition. Russia is perceived to be the leader in this competition, but then France, Japan, ROK, US, they're all competing in the market. When China comes into this competition, what will happen? That is yet to be seen. ROK has also lots of needs in various areas of civilian nuclear power development, as well as United States. As I mentioned, spent fuel management is a challenge in both ROK and USA. Without some sort of a treatment, United States cannot handle all of the waste in one repository. South Korea doesn't have a repository. They don't have any, at this point, extensive storage capacity either. Although they have on-site storage capacity in Ulchin, one of the plant, that is temporary. That is going to be full again soon, maybe within decades. So they don't have a place to store their waste beyond, at this point, 2016 or 2018, depending on where to look at. Even if you do some more immediate emergency, maybe rescue measures, still they may not be able to store it until beyond maybe 2020, 22, 24 time frame. They need U.S. approval for nuclear export. Their infrastructure, although they have the good supply chain, is not big enough to maybe meet all the demand coming from the globe. They don't have enrichment facility. They have done internal studies on the economics of enrichment. Based on the expected demand in 2030, which is about 5,700 ton SWU, the estimated cost is about less than $100 if they do it domestically, whereas the global market price is about 150. So obviously they have some economic incentive if they can do it domestically. They need to have better fundamental science basis, for example, cross-section data. They never had experience in developing cross-section data, which is the sort of the property of U.S., but then that knowledge is going away in the United States as well. They need to build stronger nuclear non-proliferation culture, although the government, administration, and academics are very strongly committed to nuclear non-proliferation culture. But then obviously some of the public, political, maybe pundits are talking about sovereignty issues. So those issues need to be addressed. In the United States, they have an issue of knowledge management. Most of the expertise are within the very old age group, and that is going to go away. And then they have a younger generation of people they hired during the nuclear renaissance period, but then after that, they haven't hired. So if you actually overlap the manpower in ROK and United States, they balance it out very nicely. It could maybe, if they combine those workforces, they could maintain the leadership for the next several decades. United States is having difficulty in penetrating world market at this point, and they need a partner for manufacturing, as we heard this morning. Their plant is too expensive, and they do not have enough customers for their current enrichment capacity. I think also United States needs to shift their focus from domestic energy option to international safety and security imperative, while the potentially U.S. influence is dwindling with lack of industrial leadership. Some of the people have asked about the nuclear fuel cycle and the economic viability of, say, pyroprocessing and so on. I have a few slides in there. I'll come back to this. So I thought maybe we can think about an integrative approach. It could be a very comprehensive cooperation that covers both front end, back end. It could cover domestic and international nuclear power development. It could be also collaboration in nuclear licensing and maybe in global stewardship. It could cover entire spectrum of science and technology, safety and security, and safeguard and preparation, starting from design, construction, manufacturing, and all the way to basic R&D and knowledge loss management. Basically, the world, maybe the global demand for nuclear power comes from various parts of the world. It could be for large power plant, or it could be a small power plant. And the U.S. has a niche for maybe 1,000, AP1000. South Korea has a niche for 1,400 market. And then for smaller reactor maybe market, they can share the expertise. They need to work together to supply all the entry plus components. U.S. could support licensing review, especially for the advanced reactors. Fuel supply capability at this point, ROK doesn't have that capability, and maybe ROK can participate, as suggested again in the morning, in U.S. enrichment facilities as a partner, or they could arrange some sort of a multilateral facility through international collaboration, or perhaps even a facility in ROK, but if black box technology is a reality. They could work together to provide the global needs in nuclear science, nuclear services. They could work together for manpower training to minimize age gap-induced knowledge loss. Again, this is a projection of the future, maybe market development for each supplier, USA, France, Russia, Japan, ROK, Canada, and then maybe US ROK to working together. You can see at least if US ROK work together, they can beat Russians. The collaboration in basic R&D could be in many different ways. Fast reactor technology, as mentioned earlier in the morning, something that US has developed over several decades. And several countries tried, but then they have difficulty. One of the main problems with fast reactors is sodium leak. But most of the sodium leak didn't happen in the primary system, didn't involve radioactivity release. But basically, it really was a bad thing for the technology. But then, Argonne National Lab, for example, had developed extensive expertise on this issue through the IFL project, but that project got canceled. The know-how still is retained, but is going away. At the same time, South Korea is developing this know-how with maybe less than maybe extensive capability, history of their development. So this collaboration could be very fruitful. Pyroprocessing technology development, where the technology was basically conceived during Manhattan Project days, or actually the technology comes from the metal processing industry. So pyroprocessing is not a new technology. It's an old technology. Everybody in the metal processing industry uses it even today. US was interested in developing this technology, but then they again dropped it after IFR cancellation. But then the project mission was translated or changed to only spent fuel treatment for EBR-2, experimental breeder reactor 2 from Idaho. But then South Korea at that point came in and then started developing this technology. And at this point, in some areas, South Korea has more development in pyroprocessing technology. The main question is safeguard of this technology. One of the main questions is safeguard. I think although this is not the same type of problem that was posed to nuclear safeguard community, many experts in the United States and other countries believe that this technology can be safeguarded if we look at it from a different point of view. Instead of looking at simply a traditional MCNA approach, materials control and accountability, if you look at it from a holistic safeguard approach, this technology can be safeguarded. So there is potentially maybe a role for collaboration. I just wanted to point out that this pyroprocessing technology can reduce the required total repository footprint by a factor of 100, which is significant in Korea. Maybe not significant in the United States, but in South Korea, a small country, factor of 100 decrease in footprint could be a really important thing. I'm sorry for this slide. It doesn't cover the whole thing, but then basically you have a normal scenario. Basically you have a total number of radioactive materials coming out from a repository. Without pyroprocessing, how much reduction, or with pyroprocessing, how much reduction in total release of radioactive materials in the 3 or 4 more orders of magnitude reduction with pyroprocessing, basically. These results are not my results. I'm stealing someone's result. I'm running this calculation. I haven't finished my model development yet, but I'm stealing the result from Junhong Han from UC Berkeley. Basically, you have a very good benefit of doing pyroprocessing, both for safety and for repository footprint from maybe economics point of view as well. Geologic disposal technology development, it's another area of collaboration. United States so far has looked at the tough rock, but then with potentially a need for alternative repository, they need to look at the saturated zone repository. And South Korea has been working on the saturated rock system. There is potentially maybe good collaboration there as well. Nuclear safety enhancement, I want to just briefly look at. Safety enhancement is becoming an important issue after Fukushima accident. U.S. interest or focus on safety discussion or enhancement is slightly different at this point from South Korea's. U.S. is looking at it from a holistic, risk-based approach, and they're looking at it mostly using passive safety. ROK is more interested in both passive and active safety. And they are also developing a lot of components in that regard. Nuclear global safeguards and security, there are a number of unfinished businesses. I guess there are some details on this in terms of developing R&D capability and technology for security and safeguards. There are a number of research topics they can work together at this point. So to finish up my discussion, I'm simply pointing out that there is a need for both countries and there are strengths from both countries. If we work together, it could be a win-win. You can take advantage of each other's need and strengths, and that could become a model for, say, atoms for peace, something that was envisioned by President Eisenhower when he first delivered that speech in 1953. I think this development could potentially strengthen global nuclear governance by maybe continuing the leadership of the United States in nuclear safety and security and safeguards in the non-proliferation arena. Potentially, with the rise of Russia and China, that regime may not sustain. Maybe this collaboration provides an opportunity for U.S. to maybe continue that leadership in nuclear safety and security and non-proliferation arena. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I felt I am in the science class as a student, but I guess the both gentlemen from Korea are trying to say that there are much technological and economical incentives for USA to take South Korea as a serious partner. Sharon, I wonder if you agree. So it's your turn to give a comments.
Well, thank you very much. Science class is over. I'm a political scientist, but I've been observing this debate for at least, pretty closely at least for 4 years. There should really be a clear connection between what we do technically and our political strategic goals. This doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's for bureaucratic reasons. You know, in the U.S., our Department of Energy has all the money. State Department doesn't have very much. Sometimes there are other reasons. But so I'm going to try and connect some of these various threads. I will say, even though I'm a political scientist, I've done a lot of work over the years in nuclear cooperation, non-proliferation, and also I used to advise Congress on these agreements. So I'm pretty steeped in ridiculous details on this. So over the last 4 years, what have I observed? A marked shift in the tenor of the debate between the U.S. and Korea on this. On the positive side, there's been an expansion of Korea's horizons to include nuclear security, a bigger stage, G20. We've heard all about that earlier. In a kind of more neutral fashion, I would say I haven't seen much definitive in the way that Korea connects its non-proliferation responsibilities to fuel cycle decisions and to exporting reactors. And I don't mean to be hypercritical of Korea in that regard. I would say when you look at what Japan is going through right now about its fuel cycle decisions, it's not really connecting the dots either. And the reason is there are a lot of political pressures, a lot of domestic pressures, a lot of financial pressures. So I say that simply as an objective observation. I don't think the U.S. does that very well either, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. On the negative side, I've seen a lot of this maybe just in the media, and I don't think we should, judge Korea on the basis of what's in the media. Goodness knows if anybody did that to the U.S., we'd be in a lot of trouble. But there's a lot more talk about nationalism, nuclear sovereignty. There's a lot more, upfront about this need for enrichment, not just pyroprocessing. And lately I've heard this a little bit of an undercurrent of, well, we'll go elsewhere, unless, U.S., you're going to lose some jobs if we don't sign this nuclear cooperation agreement, unless advance consent for enrichment and reprocessing is given. I don't think anybody believes that the U.S.-South Korean nuclear cooperation will stop. It's just the question of how best to move forward, and how do we do that. Okay, so on the two papers on this panel, I'll start first with Mansung's paper. I think you put a lot of constructive ideas on the table. particularly in the technical end of it, I quibble with some of your conclusions. But I would just add a couple things. Under industrial cooperation, you put up there about the smart reactor. I would say on small modular reactors, there's a much wider range. We don't have to just collaborate on smart reactors, but on some of the U.S. ideas also. I would also put collaboration on dry cask storage technology, just so we hit all the bases. And then on R&D cooperation, I would add deep borehole disposal. So it's not just repository. We need to expand our horizons there. On Bangun's paper, I think that your idea for this 2+2 ministerial level dialogues on nuclear energy and nonproliferation, I think it's very creative. And also the vision statement, but I don't think it's going to work for two reasons. Or I disagree with it. Not that it's not going to work, but I disagree. The first is just a practical thing. There's not enough time. This 123 agreement has to go to Congress by May. At least that's what some officials are telling me. And so even though I think it's a good idea to do this, let's do it after we find some short-term solution. On the 123 agreement, I think honestly right now, the best you can hope for is agreement to extend without prejudice. As Richard said, it still has to go before Congress, so you need to make this as neutral as possible. Maybe you do it for short term, 10 years, which, so we get to the end of the joint study on pyroprocessing, and we reconsider, because we'll have a lot more data then. On the, the joint vision, absolutely higher level diplomacy, but you do it quietly. You don't politicize it. And the reason for that is I don't agree with polishing the prestige of nuclear energy. I just don't, I don't think it's in anyone's interest. Remember, nuclear energy, it's just another way to boil water. Honestly, the more you hold this up as a bright, shiny object of desire, the more other countries will desire it without recognizing all the risks and the responsibilities. We can talk, until next week about the economics, but a lot of the economics figures are frankly made up, okay? And from country to country. And part of the reason is because, nobody's been able to make a go of nuclear energy in a private market, in a purely private market. There are a lot of government subsidies. And so once you start to subsidize, it's not just unique to nuclear, right? It's unique to a lot of the energy industry. So we don't have really good cost data. Overall, I would, on these technical areas of cooperation, I would prioritize safety and disposal, maybe small modular reactors over the fuel cycle R&D, and there we probably have a big disagreement. I don't think fuel cycle R&D gets you more economically effective nuclear energy. I think Gordon Flake made a good point earlier today when he said, maybe we could have a candid discussion with the Japanese about the cost effectiveness of enrichment and reprocessing. I would love to hear that. I don't think we'll ever hear it, but it hasn't been very cost effective for the Japanese. So I'm going to be characteristically blunt in my next few comments. I do not, I believe the nuclear industry does a good job of its own cheerleading. I don't believe that the policy community needs to do that. I think we need to be objective about the nuclear trends. And the trends are not that positive, or not as positive as what we see often in the newspaper. Either as nuclear as a % of global electricity production, or the costs, or anything else. The Chinese are slowing down. Japan's nuclear future is uncertain, and the U.S. is overwhelmed by the cheap cost of shale natural gas. Not only are we going to find it hard to build new nuclear power plants in this country, but the operating ones are shutting down. Kewaunee is being shut down because they cannot compete. This is a reactor that it has its license extended, right? Nobody wants to buy it. Nuclear power plants used to be money minters. Now, you can say that the U.S., that's a unique situation, but not as unique as you may think it is. Mansung, you also mentioned that, pyroprocessing is not a new technology. We didn't really talk too much about fast reactors and their commercialization, and I think there's been a lot of optimism about that, beyond the fact that, or the dilemma that fast reactors can pose proliferation risks, right? Because they might not all be burners. They might also be breeders of plutonium. I am going to cut short my remarks a little bit, just on the, so there's a little bit of doubt on the, this nuclear renaissance. I've been calling it nuclear enthusiasm for a few years. When you look at the big six, right, U.S., France, Russia, ROK, and the UK, 2 of those big 6 may abandon nuclear for good. If Germany does it successfully, that will send a particular message. But we won't know that for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. But then you have Switzerland, Belgium, and Taiwan that are not going to build new reactors. They're going to phase it out. What kind of signals do they send for the rest of the world? And you can point to the fact that some countries after Fukushima said they wanted nuclear power, and that would be Saudi Arabia. But I'm not sure anybody is, totally comforted by the fact that Saudi Arabia wants to build nuclear power plants when they've been pretty upfront about the connection to Iran and Iran's nuclear weapons. I would simply end my remarks with a couple questions, and that is on enrichment and this security of supply issue. Korea has focused on, when they look at security of supply, it's on the front end, but really its own, the companies that it seeks to, the countries that it seeks to export to, I'm sure they're a whole lot less interested in the front end than they are in the back end. And the front end, and this is the dilemma or the irony of a lot of these fuel assurance plans, right, that everybody's lukewarm about, whether it's the fuel bank or anything else. The irony is that the front end works. And you just have to look at Korea's history, right, over how many years with 23 nuclear power plants. What fuel supply disruptions have you had? What have you really suffered from because you didn't have domestic enrichment? And so that leads me to this point of, okay, the Nuclear Suppliers Group has a policy of restraint on transferring enrichment and reprocessing. The new criteria don't change that policy of restraint. And so, regardless of what happens with the U.S. ROK 123 agreement, if Korea wanted to go ahead and acquire some enrichment capability from the private sector, right? So you're not building your own, but you're going to buy Urenco or ETC or some other one. You would have to overcome that policy of restraint. And so 2 questions to ask. Has the ROK suffered because of the lack of domestic capability? Supply disruptions, cost, quality. And the second is there a unique argument for the ROK? So the U.S. tried to make a unique argument for India, and we had a few problems with that. It wasn't very popular. Pakistan and Israel are still saying, hey, we're just as unique as India is. Now, but those are the countries that are outside the NPT. Who stands behind Korea as being next in line? Now, you could say, well, nobody's as advanced as Korea is. But, if I were a Saudi, I would say, well, we're going to build 16 nuclear power plants, and there's no regional capability, apart from Iran, and we need to do that. All right, so when you look at the arguments for national domestic capabilities, the typical ones are prestige or sovereignty. That's not a unique argument. Security of supply, that's not necessarily unique. An alliance with the U.S., well, that's more unique, but not quite unique. And then technical, from a technical perspective, is pyroprocessing so special? Is it so different from reprocessing? And I think that we need to do I'm a supporter of the joint study that Korea is doing with the U.S., and we might learn more about that in the coming years. Lastly, dependence versus interdependence. I like the fact that we started off this today with this issue of global nuclear governance, right? Well, you don't get to global nuclear governance, however you want to define it or shape it, without a recognition of the fact that we're interdependent, right? So I would suggest that South Korea view its, as well as the U.S., right? The U.S. doesn't call the shots anymore, right? But we need to view our roles in this new framework of governance, in this new kind of framework of interdependence. And if you want to continue to think of nuclear energy as very special, you can, because some people do, but it's special on the responsibilities end and not on the rights end. And I think that's where I would start the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. I think both of Professor John and Professor Im need to respond. If you cannot overcome Sharon's sharp criticism, you cannot overcome NPT negotiator. So I'll give you an opportunity.
Pretty sharp, but kind of somewhat expected criticism, since I had some long dialogue with Sharon for a while. It's not, nuclear energy is just nuclear energy. We don't really, mystify. It's another glorious thing. It's just an energy, but it just somehow happened to be a cheap and reliable energy for some countries. Probably some countries it's not, but for some countries like Korea or many other countries believe that it's going to be a huge plus to our economy and to our industry. And in fact, Korea was believing, and many Koreans are believing, that our faster economic growth, especially our excellent export items like ships and semiconductors and all these electronics, really electricity-hungry industrial items, and that was possible because of this Korea's a very reliable and abundant electricity, and many of them are coming from this baseload nuclear energy. So we can't deny that. And many other countries are looking at Korea's case so that they could be another Korea. And we also can't deny that their aspiration. And we have a overall Korea-U.S. relationship that is very good, and that is aiming at a strategic alliance that's not really confined to Korean Peninsula, but wanted to be a more of a global. And also it should be a mutually beneficial one, instead of just providing, security assurance to Korea. There used to be a one-way a alliance. But however, we haven't really found many of these actionable items following that a very high level agreement. And I think our nuclear cooperation, I believe, could be one of a good example of implementing our very high aspiration of this strategic alliance. But in order to achieve that, I think we need to have another mission from these national leaders. So of course, we don't have much time, since we expect to complete our negotiations at least by mid-2013. We may not have time. But however, still I'd like to propose that, this new nuclear cooperation agreement could be somewhat a middle ground nuclear cooperation agreement that containing or compromising U.S. Ideas and Korean ideas, and but still we need to show Korean people and to American people what this nuclear cooperation aims to achieve. That cannot be contained in this actual text of cooperation, nuclear cooperation agreement, but that could be shown in this joint statement, in a political statement. So it could be a complementary. It could be complementary to the any text agreement between two countries that could be agreed next year. Korea was. It's not about. I think nuclear energy is not about really right or it's just energy. We want to use it, and also. We have been hearing all this morning that this right comes with responsibility. Of course, Korea was in the 60s and 70s or 80s, and when we've been using nuclear energy, we thought it's just as another energy source. We haven't thought much about the non-proliferation issues, and also Korea Koreans felt like we are controlled by IAEA. We are regulated by IAEA and the United States. But all of a sudden, since the 80s or 90s, as Korea is becoming a member of an export control regime, we are part of these regulators. And we are feeling that this a new world, this world of a strong nuclear non-proliferation, strong nuclear safety, and strong nuclear security is where we could be benefited, so that we could sell our nuclear power plants, and also we could use our nuclear energy safely domestically. So certainly it comes with a lot of Korean nuclear energy. When we are proposing we need to we can do this and that, we are sharing the responsibility that we can do, and this responsibility comes with Korea's capability to do that. We just saying that we want to do this and that, but Korea now has enough resources to contribute, and we are already implementing some of them. And this hosting of a nuclear security summit in Seoul was one of that the case. I think I better stop, and still I don't answer fully to your question.
Professor Im,
So first I want to go over some of the issues that Sharon mentioned and then try to answer some of the questions. Yes, I didn't talk about the small modular reactor development experiences in the United States. U.S. has extensive experience in developing small modular reactors based on their nuclear Navy experiences. So definitely they can work together, empower reactor, but then United States still have at least 10 years for commercialization of these reactors, whereas in South Korea they are much closer to commercialization of these reactors. That's why I mentioned SMART. But then if they can work together, that'll be a very good thing. Dry cask, the point I'm making is Doosan has also has their own dry cask technology, and they have done this on-site storage with using dry cask. So it's not a new thing for Korea. Question is, well, can you do it together? I think the problem in dry cask storage is it's becoming a political social problem. It's not easy for South Korea to just build big interim centralized dry cask storage on site. It's not easy because of the regulations. The nuclear power plant license expires, and the public, the community want everything out, including spent fuel. If you put dry storage cask there and keep it there for 100 years, public may say, no, we don't want it. Take it away. So it's not just a technical issue, it's a social, political issue, and that's where the difficulty is in South Korea. So it's just having storage is not a solution right now in South Korea. Deep borehole, yes, it is more safe and maybe more easier to site, but at the same time, its capacity is very small. One deep borehole can handle maybe spent fuel for 1 reactors. In United States, if you go with deep borehole, you need 100 deep boreholes. Whether it is deep or not, the public will not be happy about having deep borehole facility. You're talking about 100 deep borehole facilities throughout the country. Same issue with South Korea. Even if deep oil is maybe publicly less offensive, still finding that site for a number of nuclear power plants will not be an easy thing. So I'm saying it is maybe beneficial, but it's not a silver bullet. It will still have issues. I think what I'm trying to say here in this discussion is what is happening in the future and what we can do about it. I think there are still a number of countries interested in nuclear power. There are a number of newcomer countries. But at the same time, those newcomer countries are not interested in developing a huge infrastructure for nuclear power industry. They are not going to build a capacity like what we have among the suppliers, including Korea. You're talking about 1 or 2 new reactors, and that's it. They are not interested in building reprocessing capability, not even repository. As long as they can have supply guarantee, they content. So then the question is, who's going to compete and supply those technologies? Well, we saw 6 candidates out there, maybe 7, including China. Maybe even including India, maybe 8. But then what is going to happen with those market development, and who is going to provide the capability for fuel supply and maybe even spent fuel treatment or storage, maybe even disposal? So right now, South Korea doesn't have that capability. United States doesn't have the capability for spent fuel take back or spent fuel treatment or spent fuel disposal. Both countries are hampered, handicapped in that. So what I'm saying is, for enrichment, yes, U.S. has the capability. South Korea can take advantage of the U.S. capability for enrichment. But both countries do not have any capability for spent fuel treatment. While France, Russia, China, India continues with maybe their export with the capability for maybe spent fuel treatment or maybe even spent fuel take back. And as we know, those countries are all based on Purex technology. So if those countries dominate the future market and countries rely on the Russian or French maybe spent fuel capability, reprocessing capability, then we'll end up having pure plutonium spread somewhere. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think power processing is not unique, but I think power processing has better advantages. The reason why United States government made the decision that we're not going to pursue Purex, there is a reason. We want to do something better than Purex. What is better alternative? It is either Urex or Pyro. Urex, is it really better? Urex actually is more proliferation prone than, I think, Pyro. Pyro is a new thing in terms of safeguard, but it's not a new technology. So what I'm saying is, if you can develop a better assurance on safeguarding that technology, I think it is a better technology for the world. If we can say ROK, US together provide spent fuel treatment capability, I think that's much better than having Russia, France, China continuing with Purex technology. I think the world, is it United States going to need nuclear power plant? Maybe, maybe not. I think U.S. has enough of energy security. You don't need nuclear power if everything goes well as planned. Natural gas continues. You have coal. You could potentially use wind and solar power, but then the renewables will not be able to take the position of base load at this point. You don't have the grid support to support the national management of renewable energy dispatching. The whole issue, by the way, Dick Shaw from George Washington actually asked me if we'd be interested in developing a workshop on economics of reprocessing on nuclear power. So I will be serious about discussing this in transparent manner. I think maybe coming up someday. I think there will be a continuing demand for nuclear power for whatever reason. And who's going to actually provide that? That's a question I'm asking. In terms of ROK enrichment, has ROK suffered? No, we haven't suffered. Is it a unique argument? Well, I think based on the history, there is no need for enrichment in South Korea. They have actually enrichment service assurance by 2020. So they have secured the supply, but then beyond 2020, they don't have a secured long-term contract for enrichment. That's where this question about whether we want to have the domestic capability or we want to have maybe partnership or we want to build out whatever capability. That's why the South Koreans are talking about this issue. Our enrichment long-term contract ends in 2020. What do we want to do? So this is just one of the options they're considering as part of industry economics. In terms of pyroprocessing, again, I said it is different. Is it different? Not really, but I think it has a better proliferation, non-proliferation characteristic than Purex or Urex. So as an alternative, maybe it's better. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but that's why we need to talk about the research collaboration and maybe potentially a tool for future fuel cycle development and global market. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think we have about 6 or 7 minutes before the wrap up. So I'd like to invite some questions and comments from the floor. Yes.
Sharon Squassone. I'll start to talk to him simply because he talked first. Too many comments, but to be quick, United States will never run out of nuclear manpower because of the nuclear navy. So that's to be clear. Regarding something that was not mentioned but should be mentioned, cooperation could be also in the field of U.S. Import Bank and Korean Export-Import Bank. Providing financing for nuclear plants is a major issue. And we see this right now in the bid for Turkey, where you have to go to UAE to get some more money. So going together on bids, if it will provide more money support to U.S. and American export-import banks, would strengthen this kind of a bid. So that's another element of cooperation that has been mentioned and should be mentioned. And what was it? Spent fuel disposal and reprocessing. The back end is the more interesting part, even though the front end is easier to solve. Regarding pyroprocessing, it's not enough to talk about pyroprocessing as an end to itself. It's a means to something, and you have to be clear what is it a means to. Is it just the waste management side, or is it a means to allow future fast breeder reactors? And there's nothing wrong in future fast breeder reactor, but one has to be clear as to what one is talking about. As a matter of fact, if one talks about fast breeder reactor, there is even more synergism between the United States and Korea, in that the United States has got a good reactor design, but no fuel cycle. If pyroprocessing works out in Korea, there will be fuel cycle, but no reactor. So if LMRs and pyroprocessing are considered to be a good idea, there's an excellent synergistic approach to both of them, if both of them are needed at all. Regarding Sharon, I find myself in a surprising agreement with what she said. Apart from everything else I don't agree with, but one comment I got to say, you said something about countries or utilities are more interested in the back end rather than the fuel end, front end of the cycle. I think that's not exactly true. Utilities are interested in guaranteeing the fuel supply, and if in each reactor you have to worry about uranium on one side, conversion on the other side, enrichment on the other side, and fabrication on the fourth side, and you got 4 different contracts per reactor, so you got 20 reactors, pretty soon it's going to be quite tiring to keep track of everything and where everything is. If you have your own enrichment supply, then you're worried about just getting fuel for your reactor. That simplifies things. About spent fuel on the other end, that's a problem that could be delayed for the future. You cannot start a reactor without having fuel, but you could operate a reactor without having a repository for many, many years to come, as we have experienced. It's not a solution, but this is what people are worried about.
I'm afraid today my buzzword is going to be divorcing concepts, and I'm going to use this again for this session, divorcing nuclear weapons and nuclear energy in the same conversation. Excuse me, I have a cold. Sharon, you mentioned prestige, and we also heard another colleague of ours last week talk about suspicions that South Korea's aspirations for enrichment capabilities really stems from wanting status. And I can understand where that rationale and logic comes from. But I'd have to argue that I think we perhaps even subconsciously, we tend to muddle and mix in weapons and energy when we think about nuclear and when we think about status and prestige, because we think of status and prestige and we apply it to countries in the basket of countries like North Korea and Iran. They aspire nuclear weapons for status and prestige, perhaps the same rationale during the Cold War, but today's world, we're in a different world. My sense from what I'm getting from our South Korean colleagues is that the intention really isn't that nuclear energy is something special or prestigious or whatnot, but it's more a practicality and necessity. And perhaps this isn't well articulated from our South Korean colleagues enough or well enough. And so I'd suggest that we try to separate the status and prestige, unless I'm completely wrong, unless there are, unless I misunderstood. But we have heard this rationale or this argument before among our colleagues, and so I would just make that suggestion.
Okay, I think that was mainly comments rather than questions. So you wanna?
Yeah, just on that, look, nuclear energy is viewed as a prestigious endeavor, right? Now, for countries that have, years of nuclear energy experience, you can differentiate also between reactors and sensitive fuel cycle capabilities. So forget about nuclear weapons. Just as when a Jordan, for example, wants nuclear energy, there are a lot of different ways that they could get their electricity, right? But nuclear, it's a big project. It's probably the most complicated way that you could make steam. So what I object to is the putting nuclear energy in a completely separate category where we have high-level diplomatic missions and Nicolas Sarkozy traveling around the globe to promote nuclear energy. I think that countries would be better served by a very clear-eyed, objective analysis of what their electricity needs are. We have the whole thing about Japan and France, and trying to achieve energy independence, and they didn't. They actually did not reduce their oil consumption. They increased, they took oil away from their electricity generation, but the use of oil they didn't reduce their dependence on oil for the other sectors of their energy. That's all I'm saying. So anyway, forget about nuclear weapons. That was not my point. I just think you have to have an energy discussion, not just a nuclear energy discussion.
Okay, so I'll give a last comment to Professor Chun. That will be the last.
I want to just make a few quick comments. And front-end side of this enrichment issue, we are hearing from a Korean nuclear power plant expert that in order to have their own competitiveness, they need to supply nuclear power plant and the fuel as a package. This buyer don't want to have a trouble of buying plant and the fuel from separately. So they want to have a kind of assurance of this fuel is coming together as a package. Korea cannot. So they said that they want to provide the kind of a fuel so that they are seeking enrichment, not really national ownership, but whatever way. And my second comment is that nuclear power plant is, according to Sharon, is going away. It's a kind of it used to be a fashion, but not anymore. But I could see that even Germany are buying electricity from neighboring countries, and those electricities are coming from nuclear power plants, and probably Poland is happy to sell their electricity from nuclear power plants to Germany. But however, Korea cannot buy anything. And Japan was shutting down their power plant, and they are suffering a lot because of that in their own low operation of factories, and they are very they are spending too much money on gas importation, and that's causing a global problem. And also they are suffering on this financial problem in Japan. And nuclear power, it could be status symbol for some countries, but for some countries I can't really deny. But however, for many countries, for Korea too, it was like catching two birds with one stone. It's just a means to produce electricity, and also it's a big science and technology. So any countries in the world who want to advance their science technology are having interest in nuclear energy. And it has also a lot of either applied science, applied applications. So certainly, you can't really blame any countries who are having a justifiable reason to pursue nuclear energy. And I think that has been really, it's been widely supported by the IAEA, and they are promoting strongly.
Thank you. I think this kind of heated discussion will continue, obviously, to next year. And I'd like to thank you. And I'd like to ask you, join me giving a big hands to three presenters and discussants. Where is Victor? I think we are supposed to wrap up without break. Am I right?
Victor, yeah, wanted to say a few final words.
Yeah. 화장실.
I realized we talk about the audience, so I can talk about Japan issues. We'll do it next time.
You know, I would like a copy of the slides because you had some really interesting new ones on those correlations, illustrations.
That's an old study.
Okay, well, send me the old study. I have to get to another meeting.
Are we waiting for someone?
I think we're supposed to wait for Victor.
네, 끝냈어요. It's okay? Emergency call, so she asked me to finish. And let me wrap up in this way.
Oh, here's Victor.
Okay, Victor. I was wondering how we wrap up. I just giving several minutes. You want to see here? Or it's
I mean, in terms, so we have closing remarks now, right?
Right.
Let me just say, first of all, that it was a pleasure to work with EAI on this. Suk-jung and we met, I think it was last summer, and talked about some of these ideas about putting together a conference of this nature where the topic wouldn't be specifically on some difficult negotiation between the United States and Korea, but the broader context, and bring in both people who are nuclear experts as well as people who are alliance experts and regional experts. And I think in that sense the discussion today was very full, and it wasn't too narrowly focused, and it allowed everybody to look at these broader issues of nuclear governance issues in terms of civil nuclear energy, but also some possible ideas and solutions for how we deal with some of the very difficult issues when we think about the U.S. and ROK in terms of future nuclear cooperation. So I personally learned a lot from these sessions. Again, but for me it's like writing on a blank chalkboard because this is not my area of expertise at all. But I think all of us in the discussions today learned from each other. And I want to thank Richard. Richard just left. I want to thank Richard Johnson, for joining us and giving us some of the views, at least from the U.S. administration. And I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, I myself is not an expert in this field at all, but the more I read, the more I hear, there are so many complicated issues. I guess the bottom line, we all know the American government is not willing to compromise their NPT codes in this 1, 2, 3 agreement negotiation. So I think unless the Koreans come up with the more creative idea, because the Korean experts are saying we are very much committed to the NPT, but it's mainly about the regional and global issues rather than this fuel cycle. So unless we resolve this contradiction of how we can harmonize this fuel cycle right to NPT codes. It's very difficult. So we are searching for that logic. I think that will be a kind of research themes for the Korean side. And at the same time, I think South Korea needs to see this case more seriously by changing the discussion framework within the Korean society. Obviously, it's not a good idea to bring in the sovereignty issue or the alliance issues. And also, we need to study the Japan case more seriously. And also, we need to think about the North Korean issues, how we can integrate the denuclearization issue of North Korea to this NPT and the energy issues both. And thank you very much. It was fantastic, and I'd like to carry up maybe next year in Seoul. So I hope this collaboration between EAI and CSIS will continue to next year. Thank you very much.